Good morning, everyone. We should be starting. Please have a seat, and maybe we can close the door as well. Thank you. So, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear audience, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to Rondeli Security Conference with its all too timely focus on security and democracy amid geopolitical rivalry. We are delighted to have such a wide range of distinguished speakers to help us address today's outsized challenges. I would like to extend our sincere appreciation and thanks to the National Endowment for Democracy and Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, whose support and cooperation has made this year's conference possible. We meet here at the Rondeli Security Conference in Tbilisi every year to discuss issues of global and regional security. Unfortunately, with every gathering, the issues become not less complicated. The problems seem to multiply, and stakes go up and up. The global security agenda has become ever more demanding and consequential. And don't get me wrong, it's not our fault, definitely, of Rondeli Foundation. It's the world order that seems to be coming undone and needs to be fixed as soon as possible. At the top of the agenda, of course, is the ongoing Russian aggression in Ukraine, which is by far the largest war in Europe since the World War II. Right now, there does not seem to be an immediate end in sight. Russia is relentless in its attempts to destroy Ukraine's sovereignty. Every one of us in this room knows just how much depends on the outcome of this war. If Russia wins, Ukraine's national freedom will be destroyed along with its nascent democratic institutions. New atrocities, to include murders and mass repression, would follow with new waves of refugees fleeing to Europe. Moldova would become the next target of Russian aggression, and in Georgia, the twin deadly threats of Russian domination and authoritarianism would become unstoppable too. Furthermore, as we have been hearing ever more clearly from the highest levels of leadership, the danger of direct military conflict between NATO and Russia is growing. Therefore, Ukraine must win, and Putin's regime must be defeated. For this, it desperately needs military, financial, and political support now. Right up there next to Ukraine on our agenda is the conflict between Israel and Hamas. On October 7, 2023, we all watched in horror as a horrific terrorist attack unfolded against peaceful civilians in Israel. The fragile peace in the Middle East has all but collapsed. Terrorists still hold the hostages. Israeli defense forces continue their military operations. The Houthis are jeopardizing critical regional security and global shipment routes. Where is all of this heading? If unchecked, this may mean a wider regional military confrontation. There is no clear path towards long-term security and stability in the region without forward-looking diplomacy. Even as we worry about Russia's war in Ukraine and military confrontation in the Middle East, we cannot forget about China. So far, the US and China have kept each other in check, understanding that a flare-up in the global competition would have negative consequences for the rest of the world. This is not just a fight about global leadership. It is a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism that will define the emerging world order. The generations to come will not forgive us for a failure. Last but definitely not least on the agenda is Georgia. The Georgian people clearly choose democracy over autocracy, a choice that Russia has been trying to suppress ever since through diverse means and tools. Georgia's choice is based on the understanding that freedom and democratic development represent the only path towards security and prosperity, and this can only be secured by becoming an indivisible part of the European Union and NATO. There is no room for doubt. Now is the time for bold and unified action. These issues and many others will be discussed during these 2 days at our conference. And thank you. I'm really grateful for all of you for being with us today in Tbilisi. In addition to the keynote presentations and panels, there will be also screening of a documentary about Georgian volunteers in Ukraine. And don't miss this opportunity because it shows how we feel about this war and what is the driving force behind the decision to fight shoulder to shoulder with Ukrainians. Once more, I would like to thank National Endowment for Democracy for the support and Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung to both of these organizations, not only for supporting this specific conference, but for throughout the years supporting Georgia's resilience and path towards democracy. Thank you, Mr. Kenneth, Wollack, and thank you, Marcel, Röthig. Finally, our thanks goes to Swedish government, as we would not have been the same what we are without your support. And but not least, we are thankful to the British Embassy in Tbilisi for their contribution. Thank you to all of us and good luck. And with this now, I would like to give a floor to Chairman of the National Endowment for Democracy, Mr. Kenneth Wollack. Please, floor is yours.
Thank you, Eka. Good morning. On behalf of the board and staff of the National Endowment for Democracy, we are a proud supporter of this important gathering. Under the leadership of Eka Metreveli, the Rondeli Foundation has contributed measurably to the development of public policy in Georgia and the region. The Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies is inspired by and honors the legacy of Alexander Rondeli. He would be very proud of your ongoing mission and work. The conference is also an important opportunity for all of us to reaffirm our solidarity with the Ukrainian people as they continue to bravely fight for their sovereignty and their freedom. And I'm honored to join Ambassador Dunnigan on this stage. Both Washington and Tbilisi are fortunate to have the ambassador here at this important time to advance the relationship between our two countries based on shared interest and values. I have come to Georgia on many occasions over the past 30 years during my time as president of the National Democratic Institute, a core institute of the NED. I retired in 2018, and I am pleased to return once again under the auspices of the endowment itself. Like so many other visitors, I have had a long-standing love affair with this country. My wife, as well as my NDI chairman, Madeleine Albright, knew all too well of the affair and grew accustomed to my obsession. It is incurable. When NDI first opened its office in Tbilisi in the early 1990s, our Georgian partners taught us how to turn on handmade heaters and power generators in our offices and apartments, which in those days did not have electricity, gas, or water supply. We were never treated like foreigners looking to fulfill contractual obligations. Our work was grounded in relationships with political parties, parliament, government, and civil society. One prominent political leader called us de facto citizens of Georgia, caring about it, being proud of its successes, and feeling its pain in difficult moments. In a sense, the Georgian people nationalized our staff. Our Georgian staff members went on to become political activists, parliamentarians, diplomats, civic leaders, cabinet ministers, and even a president. We, in turn, saw this country as a unique post-Soviet republic. Despite all of its challenges from outside your borders and from within, what differentiated Georgia from its neighbors was what I have called political ferment. In other words, politics, albeit rough and tumble, has been alive, if not always well, despite suffering from the curse of dominant political parties since independence. While there is not a political party in the world that does not wish to have a constitutional majority, allowing for speedy decisions and obviating the need for communications, concessions, and compromises, which, after all, are cornerstones of democracy, along with the principles of tolerance and freedom of expression and assembly. The problem with dominant parties and the concentration of power is that when the party is wrong, there is no one to stop them from bad decisions and results. While Rondeli Foundation has honored your founding president, I would like to take the liberty for a moment to honor another Georgian, an intellectual who had a similar vision of a democratic Georgia that would take its rightful place in the Euro-Atlantic family of nations. Zurab Zvanja, who died 19 years ago last month, was a friend of mine. As for so many of his colleagues and admirers, and perhaps many in this room, he taught me about what can be achieved by a deep and abiding commitment to democracy, by the power of ideas, and by a dedication to public service. During Shevardnadze's presidency, Zura was chairman of the parliament and a leader of the ruling party. While operating within a dominant, if not one-party system, he paradoxically assumed the mantle of an unofficial leader of a loyal opposition, challenging presidential appointments who he considered unfit to serve, and changing budgets that the president submitted to the legislature. Almost single-handedly, Zura was establishing the foundation for a genuinely independent and representative institution. And to his credit, Shevardnadze acquiesced to Zura's bold and principled role. And so was born democratic politics in a neighborhood scarred by years of communist rule. Zura's words and presence did not stir the masses, and he knew it. Instead, he was a political practitioner whose quiet demeanor masked a keen intellect and sheer persistence. Years after his untimely death, I heard from more than one of his fellow lawmakers say how they would often ask themselves when dealing with a thorny political or policy issue. They would say, what would Zura do? And during the demonstrations a year ago, protesters, many of whom were too young to even remember his leadership, broadcast Zura's voice over loudspeakers. We are Georgians, therefore we are Europeans. As Prime Minister, Zura led by building coalitions and consensus, by understanding and responding to the concerns of his allies as well as political adversaries. Sadly, since his death, polarization has marked Georgian politics. Perhaps the best way to begin a process for finding common ground is for both sides of the political divide to honor Zvanya's legacy by once again asking, what would Zura do? With U.S. support, the European Union rightfully granted Georgia its candidacy status last year, reflecting the hopes and aspirations of the Georgian people. This year will be a series of tests to determine in October whether or not membership negotiations will begin. Those tests include adherence to the so-called 9 steps, Georgia's foreign policy alignment with the EU's common foreign and security policy, and of course, free and fair elections in October. This is the year of elections globally, the most in world history, with 100 countries holding elections with more than 50% of the world's voting age population going to the polls. Some elections will reflect the genuine will of the electorate, reflecting the rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international covenants. Others, close to 30%, will be stage managed, with the outcomes predetermined. This is certainly the case in most polls in the former Soviet Union, particularly in Belarus and Russia, which shows that even autocrats, in a perverse way, need to claim legitimacy. Last month's snap presidential elections in Azerbaijan saw Ilham Aliyev garner more than 90% of the vote, a margin of victory that would make even Lukashenko and Putin blush. Then there are electoral gray areas, like in Georgia, which over the years have been more or less representative, but oftentimes flawed, plagued by weak institutions, the use of state resources, and actions by overzealous partisans who violate electoral laws and have operated generally with impunity. While Georgian elections are markedly better than those of many of its neighbors, they have not markedly improved in the last 20 years following the failed elections that triggered the Rose Revolution. We hope that 2024 will improve on this record. Why are elections important? It bears repeating. They reinforce the understanding that state sovereignty belongs to and flows from the people of a country. Elections, therefore, are organized explicitly to ascertain and honor the people's will as to who should occupy elected office and govern in the people's interest. But elections are much more than a technical exercise in which ballots are printed and votes are cast and counted. Elections are singularly important because they demonstrate how government treats its citizens. That is because they reflect how most every democratic institution functions. Beyond elected management bodies, these institutions include the executive, the parliament, the judiciary, the security forces, the media, political parties, and civil society. In short, elections serve as a stress test for nearly every institution in a free society, and for the compact between citizens and the government that represents them. Ultimately, more than electoral competition is required. Democratic governments must foster pluralism, competition among individuals and groups in all areas of economic, cultural, and political life, as well as a diffusion of economic and political power. For freedom of the individual, as Montesquieu and de Tocqueville might have put it, requires many bodies to intervene between the citizen and the central authority. These include vibrant and vocal civil society groups. Ideally, over time, all of this breeds in individuals and their government the most essential behavioral characteristics of a democracy: tolerance for diversity and a willingness to compromise, which allows a society internally and a nation internationally to resolve conflicts nonviolently. This is not only a challenge for Georgia, but for all democratic nations. For as President Kennedy once said, democracy is not a final destination, but rather a call to an untiring effort. This year, that call will be rather loud for both your country and mine, and for many other countries around the world. Thank you very much.
Mr. Wollack, thank you for your speech, for mentioning Alex Rondeli. 8 years since he passed away, but every day his deeds are opening the doors and paving the road for me in my work. So thank you. And with this, I would like to ask Marcel Röthig, head of the South Caucasus Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung office. Please, Marcel.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear excellencies, dear Eka, dear Mr. Wollack, also on behalf of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, Germany's oldest political foundation, I would like to express our welcome, but also our big thanks to the great team of the Rondeli Foundation for your continuous partnership, your commitment to Georgia's international standing, the great cooperation and our friendship. We are honored. We are very much honored to be part of this conference. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the world has fallen apart. When we turned our attention to Ukraine at this conference last year, our hopes were that the picture would be better today. It's not. More than ever, the future of Europe seems under question. It's no longer about the debate whether Ukraine will liberate its territory as soon as possible, but these days it's unfortunately again more about the fundamental: will Ukraine stand? With great worries, we are looking towards Ukraine's Western allies. Will we, as the West, maintain strategic patience? Do we need to become even more resolute in our support for Ukraine and immediately at the same time take much more serious steps for our own defense? Where are the United States heading as Ukraine's most important partner? Is Europe possibly left on its own in a very dark future? And does Russia even have a future now that with the death of Alexei Navalny, probably a last spark of hope has disappeared? In addition to all this, another event deeply shocked us on October 7th last year, when Hamas attacked Israel in an unimaginable way. The already complicated situation in the Middle East has become even more torn, and it has exposed internal conflicts in our own societies. And also, the South Caucasus was not spared from fundamental developments. We saw that peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan is still far, far away. But we also experienced small signs of hope. Georgia has achieved what most of us did not think possible before February 24th, 2022. Georgia is a candidate for EU membership and will enrich the European Union together with Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, and the Western Balkans in a hopefully not too distant future. It is nothing less than the historic step towards the perfection of the European idea. Although it must be clear to all of us that without the sacrifices of the Ukrainian people, this decisive development for Georgia would probably never have happened. Now that the doors are open, it's up to Georgia to take the necessary steps and to move on. Ladies and gentlemen, at this conference we are not only speaking about the great challenges of our times, but we are also welcoming a very special guest here tomorrow. The President of Iceland, Mr. Johannesson, will attend our conference. And if I may tell you a small secret, which makes us very proud, it is the first ever official state visit from Iceland here in Georgia. And this visit became possible because we invited him to our conference. It was us doing the very first step to invite the President of Iceland. He agreed. And so we basically contributed to the history books of Georgian diplomacy with this very, very important visit. And I'm curious to hear what the President will share with us tomorrow. We see that he's here even for several days. He's, I think, today even visiting the contact line. So that's something very important. And it's not just official meetings here in the capital, but it's so much more that can be strengthened. Small states have to stick together, and we're going to see what are the results tomorrow. Coming back to the big issues that bring us together here in Tbilisi today and tomorrow, the conference is a unique platform. Here for Georgia, we would like to give you and us the opportunity to exchange views. A lot has changed in these years, but the main task maybe has not. The task of foreign policy has remained, as the former German Chancellor Willy Brandt described without any pathos, namely the illusion-free effort to contribute to the solution of conflicts, to help bring about peace in a contentious world full of crises and conflicts, full of resentment and hatred. And peace cannot be wished for. It does not come about through public declarations, not even through UN resolutions. Even the question of who is right is irrelevant. Peace has to be achieved. Mostly when what is needed to make peace, namely trust, has already been completely ruined. Therefore, when parties to the conflict can no longer come together, then it depends on third parties, on platforms, on partners. When nothing works, when the world is in demand, then we must not refuse. Let us contribute. Let us contribute our part. Thank you.
Thank you, Marcel. Maybe next time we can invite German Chancellor or the US President. You know, you are. But with this, I would like to give a floor to Her Excellency Ambassador of the United States in Georgia, Robin Dunnigan. Thank you, Ambassador, for the support of our country, our foundation from the very beginning, back in 2001, and also for continuing the tradition of addressing the conference. Thank you. Please.
Thank you, Eka. Thank you for inviting me to address such a tremendously distinguished, smart, experienced group of professionals. And thank you to you and to Rondeli Foundation for our close collaboration and cooperation over many, many years, and the role you've played in strengthening Georgia's path to Euro-Atlantic integration. I also want to say a quick word of thanks to Ken, who over his decades of stewardship of NDI and as chairman of NED, has contributed not only to democratic growth here in Georgia, but across the globe. So it's really an honor to follow you, Ken, on a stage. And Marcel, of course you do. As I pondered your topic of security and democracy and geopolitical rivalry, I thought about remarks that President Biden gave on January 6th this year. It was the 3rd anniversary of the storming of the US Capitol, which was a real test to our own democracy in the United States. In his remarks, President Biden asked a compelling question: is democracy still our sacred cause? He told the story of winter 1777 as George Washington led the Continental Army in a very harsh winter to Valley Forge to fight a war against the most powerful empire that existed at the time. George Washington's mission was clear: liberty, not conquest; freedom, not domination; national independence, not individual glory. Never again would we, the United States, bow down to a king. As he recounted that story, President Biden asked, is democracy still our sacred cause? I hope you've guessed that the president's answer was a resounding yes. Democracy is a sacred cause, our sacred cause. It's our single most powerful tool for unleashing human potential and delivering for citizens. Democracies are more inclusive, more equitable, more peaceful, and more prosperous. I could spend a lot of time listing the benefits of democracy, but here in Europe, we have a tragic but very real example of just how valuable democracy is. For 2 years, President Putin has been trying to beat Ukrainians into submission, but the Ukrainian people have refused to bow down to Putin. They have fought back, and they've done so valiantly and effectively. Vastly outnumbered, they have not only defended their land, but their freedom, their democracy, and their identity. Ukrainians have shown all of us how much they value democracy, too many of them paying for it with their lives. And the world has responded too. In resolution after resolution, members of the United Nations have condemned Russia and President Putin for his actions. The West has not fractured. We have remained united to support democracy in Ukraine. Instead of being weakened, NATO has grown. It's stronger, more unified, spending more money on collective defense, bigger by 1 and hopefully tomorrow by 2 members. We've built a coalition of more than 50 nations, united for 2 years, standing strongly by Ukraine in its fight for its democracy. Nearly $200 billion have come in from across the world to support Ukraine. And I have faith in the American people, in our assistance, that no matter what happens in our own election, we will continue to support Ukraine. Having worked on this issue for 2 years prior to my job here, and spending many, many hours with our Congress talking about the fight for Ukraine, I know there is strong bipartisan support in America for this cause. So is democracy still our sacred cause? Yes, I believe it is. And we have shown that we're willing to fight for it, pay for it, stand by Ukraine. But democracy isn't always easy, as Ken laid out. Democracy doesn't happen by accident. It requires constant effort, constant tending by each new generation, by each of us. In America, our own democracy is still a work in progress after all these years. We don't hold all of the solutions. We host the Summit of Democracies every year for exactly this reason, to join with other countries, other democracies, to work together, to share ideas on how we improve the lives of our citizens. One element that distinguishes democracies is our willingness to confront challenges out in the open, transparently, acknowledge our shortcomings, not to sweep them under the rug, not to pretend they don't exist. It's one of our greatest strengths, but it's not always easy, and it's seldom comfortable. In other words, democracy can be messy. It means acknowledging that patriots who love their countries and want the best for their countries don't always agree on how to get there. It means that every voice matters, every individual has a stake in the future. It means, as you said, Ken, tolerance, compromise. And it means that institutions need to continue to work, to be better, to be stronger, to be more accountable to the citizens that they're there to serve. So I want to turn now to the relatively young and vibrant democracy here in Georgia, and the special friendship that Georgians and Americans share. I think that this special friendship and partnership that we've shared with Georgia for so many years is rooted in our love for liberty, freedom, core elements of democracy. It's rooted in the belief that if we have the freedom to do so, through hard work and dedication, we can leave a better world for our children. And my top priority as U.S. ambassador here is to deepen that friendship, support Georgia on its democratic path, particularly its path to EU membership. Georgia has made remarkable progress in its years since regaining its independence. That was recognized when the EU granted Georgia candidate status. I believe Georgia's Euro-Atlantic trajectory is inevitable. It's enshrined in Georgia's Constitution. It's supported by 90% of the Georgian people. It's a core element of Georgia's foreign policy. Georgia's place is in the Western family of democracies. But there is a lot of hard work ahead to get there. All segments of society will need to play a role. They will need to unify to achieve this goal of EU membership. Again, it gets back to the difficult but necessary elements of democracy: tolerance, inclusiveness, compromise. I strongly believe Georgia will be able to do it, that you'll get there. I hope sooner rather than later that you will be a member of the European Union. And I can commit that the United States will be Georgia's partner, strongest partner in this journey along the way. So I am so looking forward to the remarks that will be coming over the next 2 days from this really tremendous group of experts. I thank again the Rondeli Foundation for organizing this conference, and look forward to a fruitful conference. Thanks.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador Dunnigan, for the speech and for the support. And with this, we can proceed to our first panel. And also, I would like to welcome here to GFSI's Rondeli Foundation, Tbilisi, Georgia, our special guest, 19th President of, Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honorable Kim Campbell. Thank you for being with us. That is the honor and pleasure to host you. Please.
So hello, everyone. My name is Christian Carl, and I'm very, very honored to be here today. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope we can keep it interesting for you. That's certainly my priority. So Ken, I wonder if we can start with you. You've had an amazing career promoting the sacred cause of democracy. Right now, unfortunately, the United States is not presenting a very edifying spectacle as far as democracy goes. Everywhere you look, we see dysfunction, polarization, disillusionment. It's not a pretty picture. So can we still credibly claim to be a model of democracy for the world? That's a claim that, especially in the global South right now, seems quite greeted with a certain degree of skepticism. How do we go forward? How can the West, with the United States in particular in the lead in many respects, how do we go forward promoting the cause of democracy under these current conditions?
As Ambassador Dunnigan said, we have our own challenges with democracy. And this year is a particularly challenging moment. But if the effort of the United States is to be an example in which we tell the rest of the world that you have to adopt our system, you have to follow our lead, you have to do what we do, you have to organize the structures that we've established, then you're right. But if you believe that we're part of a larger solidarity network of small d Democrats helping each other, I think that's how the rest of the world, or struggling Democrats in the rest of the world, see our country. I just pulled up something that some of you may remember. Fred Hyatt, who is the editorial page editor of the Washington Post, who died, I think, about 2 years ago. He was brilliant.
He was my boss.
He was your boss, that's right. And I keep by my side something he wrote in 2004, not 2024. And he said, dictators forever have sought to deflect criticism by playing the anti-Americanism. The difference now is that the United States can hardly talk back. Some will say that this is all to the good if it diminishes the hubris of what President Clinton has called the indispensable nation. They will say that slave-owning, Indian eradicating, dictator-propping America was never anything but a fraudulent champion of human rights. But if you could ask the dissidents and human rights champions who over the decades in isolated prison cells and frozen work camps have somehow gotten word that U.S. diplomats or presidents had not forgotten them, if you could ask the elected leader of Burma who is still under house arrest, or the peasants who are being chased from their villages in Western Sudan, or the Democrats being slowly squashed in Hong Kong by the communists in Beijing, if you could ask any of them, you might get a different answer. They might tell you that the United States has never been perfect, has never done enough, has never been free of hypocrisy, but also that if America cannot take up their cause, no one will. No one could say it better than Fred.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. So, Kim, it's a great honor to be chatting with you today. It used to be when we talked about democracy promotion, we talked about supporting political parties, monitoring elections, something that Ken has a very long and honorable record participating in. But all of that pales in insignificance today against the struggle of the Ukrainian people for sovereignty and self-determination against the invading forces of the Russians. I've heard some people argue that the most important democracy promotion exercise in the world today is assisting Ukraine in its fight against Russian aggression. Do you see it that way? Is that too simplistic? Is that overstating the case? I mean, Ukraine is a very, very important cause in your country, specifically. Are we wrong to see that struggle as primary, or are we perhaps not seeing it as primary enough? Try this one.
They probably all work if you know how to turn them on. Well, I think it is primary, and I think what we have to understand is that we sometimes have certain inflection points in history. And incidentally, when I was asked to speak to this panel and talk about democracies versus autocracies, I thought, my goodness, you know, how can I talk about this in a few minutes? Can we all go away for a weekend together? Because there's so much to say. But I was trying to think about what are some of the broad brushstrokes of the question. And you know, all democracies carry within them the seeds of their own destruction, you know, to quote Marx, and that our very liberties and democratic processes can sometimes be used and abused to work against democratic values. And what we see now with the, and I said I was a Soviet specialist in my youth, so it's all deja vu when I watch what's happening. But I think what we're seeing is the kind of pushback that comes from a fear of democracy, which is Russia not wanting to have a successful democratic Ukraine on its border. And let me tell you, they're raising their eyebrows about Georgia too, I'm sure, which is why we need to think about how we push back against that. And so supporting Ukraine is very important. It's fundamental. It's like, it's the Munich scenario all over again. We know what happens in this scenario when we don't see the reality. We've had so much success with democracy, it's sometimes hard for democracies who are now peaceful and prosperous to get back in that mindset and realize that the threats are real, that we have to deal with them. But the other side of it is that the most important thing about democracies actually is not elections. They're necessary but insufficient, but it's the rule of law, which means that even governments are subject to the law. And that is why adherence to the acquis of the European Union, because political reform is so difficult. It's difficult in advanced democracies or mature democracies, not to mention emerging democracies. But those other steps are also important. Helping countries to be supported in their reform and creation of democratic values through the support of other countries. And the EU has been a great democracy promotion organization because of what it requires, the conditionalities of membership. So if we fail in Ukraine, it would be such a disaster because none of us are under any illusions that that would be the end of it for Putin. But it's also a first step that we need to strengthen and fortify Ukraine, Georgia, other countries that may be under threat with the institutions and democratic culture that they need to continue. And in that partnership with organizations like the EU and NATO that require certain changes. And again, as I say, political reform is so difficult that I remember when I was in my early days as in the Club of Madrid, when I was Secretary General of the Club of Madrid, an organization of former presidents and prime ministers, and Valdis Burkovs, who was Prime Minister of Latvia when they were negotiating to join the EU. And he said to me, my negotiators would come back from Brussels and they'd say, we have to make these changes because Brussels says we have to do it. And he would say, no, we have to do it because it's good for Latvia. And then he would say, well, of course, we'll never get it through Parliament just because it's good for Latvia. So those conditionalities are incredibly powerful. And so that's part and parcel. But we have to, you can't do anything without security. And if we don't understand what's happening in Ukraine and the need for Ukraine to win this battle so that they can create the democracy, then we're missing the point. So it's primary, but it's the first of a number of important steps.
So Max, is yours working? Yeah, excellent. Well, things are looking up. So Max, as you well know, when the Biden administration came in, when Biden came into office, he talked a lot about democracy and how it should be a centerpiece of American foreign policy. We convened, among other things, this grandiose summit of democracies, which in retrospect, looks to have been a bit of a disappointment. And it's a little hard to see that democracy promotion has really become what Biden wanted it to be. There have been some successes, support of Ukraine, but a lot of things haven't really happened. How would you characterize the Biden administration's record on supporting democracy overseas?
Well, I think it's been quite strong. I think the ambassador's speech is a sign of that, and I also think that the purest form of democracy support is in the U.S. commitment to Ukraine, and I think it's incumbent upon the Congress to continue that. I do think that the summit for democracy it didn't quite hit the mark on what I think was what is needed on the part of the U.S. government. And part of the logic originally was not the summit for democracy, but the summit of democracies. Now that's a crucial distinction in many respects, because the idea for this came out of think tank land in Washington, and part of it I think was based off of this understanding, and when looking at U.S. foreign policy, particularly in the post 9/11 world, is that if you were a democracy and if you were sort of trudging along in Africa or Latin America and were somewhat stable, you didn't have a huge crisis, well, guess what? The U.S. was not paying a lot of attention to you. You were not getting major visits from senior U.S. officials. Maybe occasionally, but really we were focused on where there's a crisis. And I saw this from my time at the State Department, focused more on the security side, where our tools for engaging with countries didn't lend us to actually providing a lot of support and engagement with democracies. It was much more focused on, is there a crisis? Well, then there's security assistance that was going to funnel into your country. And I think that makes sense in the sort of post 9/11 era, where we were focused on the potential for state collapse and counterterrorism. But as I think the thing that we've realized over the last 10 to 15 years is that democracy is not inevitable. And I think that's sort of the turning point, I think, in Washington was really the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring not leading to a flowering of democracy, but yet sort of a conservative response, in some ways akin to kind of an 1848 situation in Europe, where you had democratic uprisings and then they all basically did not result in a democracy or in democracy flourishing. And then we saw, but we also saw the counter trends, where whenever there was an effort to push back or suppress democracy, particularly 10 years ago in Ukraine with Maidan, here in Georgia last year, but also throughout the last decade, that there was still this urging for democracy, this desire for democracy. And I think part of what the Biden administration has struggled with is how, in this era of geopolitical competition, where you are competing with a rising, not just a rising power, but a major superpower in China that does not believe in democracy, and it is engaging with the rest of the world in a tremendous way, and some of it positive, but some of it more malign in terms of, at least from a democratic lens. And I saw this in Africa and many countries where we would go to try to strengthen our security ties, and then we're going into ministries of defense and intelligence that are all built by the Chinese. And here we are offering peanuts in terms of how we're engaging. And so I think when I think of a summit of democracy or summit for democracy, what I was actually thinking of is more bringing democracies together to network and link democracies, not necessarily to talk about how great democracy is, but to provide things, to provide prestige, to provide benefits. So when the U.S., Europe, and especially wealthy Asian countries like Japan and Korea, we all get together, well, a lot of poorer countries want to be in that room as well. And that's what we haven't really provided. And I think, the focus on the G7 being built up again, and that's great, and it's done, I think, a lot, but the G7 isn't involving a lot of the smaller democracies, right? They don't get a kind of a voice there. And I think that that's where, when we talk about engaging the global South, part of it is that we haven't really structured in the U.S., and I think this is true in Europe as well. We haven't really engaged in a way that really builds ties and then wants countries to become democratic and then to stay on the democratic path.
Excellent, thank you. I think Ken wanted to add something.
I would just say, I think we have to be honest with each other that the United States or European countries are not human rights organizations, governments are. And there are going to be inconsistencies. Some would say hypocrisy. But I remember traveling to Peru with Madeleine Albright after Fujimori stepped down. And she was pummeled by a number of Peruvians because of what they perceived as U.S. engagement with the Fujimori government. And she said, you know, this was an unpleasant experience for me. She said, but it's very difficult when you're sitting behind that desk in the State Department and you're wearing that hat and you have to deal with terrorism issues and you have to deal with corruption issues and you have to deal with drug issues. And it's for somebody who is a strong advocate of democracy program, she came to a realization of these tensions that exist. But what has changed over the last 40 years is that from governments, and Ambassador Dunnigan can talk about this better than I can, but every ambassador, American, European ambassador, ambassadors from OECD countries, have democracy as part of their portfolios. Now, it may not be the number one agenda on the bilateral relations, but it's part of the relationship. And they fund lots of organizations. There are now networks of intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, political parties, donor aid agencies that didn't exist 40 years on this issue. Now they don't all work uniformly or effectively, but there is an international democratic architecture that exists. And the United States and the OECD countries, I think, play an important role in that effort.
Thank you very much. So we don't have a whole lot of time, so if my honored panelists don't object, I would like to open it up to questions from the audience. I am pro-democracy, but when it comes to panels, I tend to be very focused on making the trains run on time. So please, no elaborate political statements. Let's ask questions like journalists, maybe. Try to keep it short and to the point, please. So,
hi.
and please introduce yourself, as you were about to do when I interrupted you.
My name is Salome Samandashvili. I'm a member of parliament and former ambassador to the European Union. The title of this panel is "Who is winning, democracy versus autocracy?" And I would say neither. And who is really winning is hybrid between democracy and autocracy, because, you know, I think that what has been undermining democracy the most over the past several decades is persistence of hybrid regimes and how they can survive. And I wonder, what are your views whether the strategy of the Western countries supporting democracy is well suited to address this particular challenge, which I think is very modern challenge, and I'm not 100% sure that we're handling it very well. Thank you.
Fantastic question, and perhaps also an opportunity to talk a little bit about the problem of disinformation, which I think is involved in that. Would you willing to tackle hybrid?
Well, I think because we're facing threats and opportunities for incursions into democracies, I think that the rule of law is a superpower for democracies when they know how to use it. And when, for example, corruption is one of the great things that undermines democracies. And again, we have to go back to a sense of loss. Who are the people who push back? People who think they've lost something, whether they've lost social position because of the enfranchisement of marginalized people, or the security of their income, if there may be democratic norms, etc. But what we have more and more are international links to struggle against these things, whether it's in areas of money laundering, and other forms of corruption. So I think that these weakening of democracy and creating what you call the hybrid systems, that the pushback is for democracies that are fully committed to the rule of law to find ways of using their strengths, which is to create enforceable legal regimes to push back. And I would say also with respect to technology, even AI. I just saw an AI, a deep fake picture of Donald Trump with a group of African American women that has been posted as to try and communicate a message, and it made my blood run cold. But democracies have the capacity to come together to create legislative frameworks globally, or at least among democracies, that can help push back on that. So I think that the weaknesses we have are often because certain abilities to undermine democracy outstrip the speed with which we respond with the powers that we have to answer them and to try to limit their effect, and therefore allow these, as you say, these hybrid democracies, as they're called, to get a foothold.
Yeah,
I think you wanted to say something.
no, I think one of the strengths and then marketing weaknesses of democracy is that we don't dwell on our successes. And one of my first experiences in government was working on counter-piracy off the coast of Somalia, which was this issue that was never going to go away and was this scourge of international trade. And tackling it required this tremendous global effort. It wasn't just about putting naval ships in. It was like this full-on effort. And then when suddenly piracy went down and drastically, I was expecting, is there going to be sort of a ticker tape parade for all the hardworking State Department officers that were working on this? And no, it's just everyone just moved on to the next thing and no one thinks about it again. There was a movie made, but Captain Phillips with Tom Hanks, and that's, I think, the one kind of recognition of success. And we move on to the next issue. So we dwell on our weaknesses, our problems. And right now, when we think about the war in Ukraine, there's a rival security conference that a few hours further west of here a few weeks ago, and everyone was incredibly depressed about the state of the world. But if you were to ask me 2 years ago what Ukraine was going to look like, I would have said, is Ukraine going to still exist at this time 2 years ago? And the fact that the United States and Europe and other democracies around the world rallied in support without really doing a lot in some degree. We, of course, did a lot. We provided a lot of assistance and a lot of support. But also the strength of democracy within Ukraine to rally and fight back, in some ways demonstrates the strength of democracy and the hollowness of autocracies, right? There was lots of, with Vladimir Putin and with Russia, this sense of how strong Russia was and how much they had built up their military and their armed forces. And what you actually saw, I think, was the hollowness of autocracy on display with that invasion, where it was completely ill-planned. It was not done in a thorough way on the part of Russia. So I think we dwell on our negatives while autocracies, wallow in their own praise. And that, I think, is in some ways their own weakness. But then when it comes to marketing the success of our systems, I think that's where we find ourselves in a challenge. And of course, any leader that is in charge of a country that doesn't want to leave power then wants to point to these other models of success. And so I think that's our major challenge, is that there are examples now of successful autocracies, and we need to demonstrate over the long term that democracy is still the way to go, and maybe highlight some more of the successes and some of our strengths.
Thank you very much. So I believe you had a question? Yes?
Hello, Batukutelia, Atlantic Council of Georgia. Fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. Most of the issues you discussed are very important and immediate challenges that democracy faces. Mostly we are discussing how democracy is reacting on the challenges that autocratic world throws to us. Don't you think it's a good time for democracy to be more offensive instead of being reactive and proactive? And if so, how should we put democracy on offensive? Thank you.
Would you like to try that one?
Sure. You're absolutely right, Batu. We're facing obviously new challenges. Christian mentioned the whole notion of the darker side of of the internet. The ability of regimes to use sophisticated and traditional means to stifle dissent or independent ideas. And now you have malign actors that not only brutalize their own citizens, but are engaged beyond their borders. Anne Applebaum has called this Autocracy Inc. Russia, China, and Iran. And it's not that they have created these regimes, but now these indigenous autocratic leaders have an international support system, and they have protection. So local Democrats in these countries are not only struggling against their own autocratic regimes, but they're fighting autocrats from other countries as well that are operating in their country. So there are whole new challenges, I think, that exist. And it requires, I mentioned this notion of the international architecture for democracy because I think it's important. 40 years ago, none of this existed. Perhaps the German Stiftungen that played such an important role in Spain and Portugal in the 1970s, that was it. And when the National Endowment for Democracy was established, we joined that effort. Now that effort is expanded in these international networks. And I think the challenge is, how do we harness all of these institutions, organizations, and networks in an effective way that can intervene in these places? Not as the United States, or not as France, or not as Germany, but in a collective way to deal with these challenges. And I think if this is done collectively and globally, we can do it, but it's going to require tremendous leadership. But the elements are there, the instruments are there, if we can harness them.
Thank you very much. I might just interject my own opinion here. I think that disinformation in particular is one area where we are still far too reactive and defensive in our attitudes. I think we've made a lot of progress identifying the issue and building resilience, but I don't see actually that we've found a good way to go on the offensive against authoritarian disinformation efforts. And I'm always looking out for interesting suggestions on that front. Oh, yes.
Well, I think just to pick up from that, the unit of human understanding is the story. And Max just told a wonderful story that people don't know. I know as often, I've been a political science professor. In fact, one of my students is here. And I would make reference to some historical event and the students would look blankly at me. I think a lot of people do not know the origin of the world, of the institutions of the world in which they live. They don't understand the price that was paid for their freedom. They don't understand some of the bad things that happened. They don't understand what are the signs when somebody is talking like a dictator and, maybe you should sit up and take notice. So I think we need to tell the stories in ways that are relevant and meaningful to new generations of people, because it's not just a question of going on the offensive. Part of the way of going on the offensive is to be so resilient and so well armed with knowledge and understanding of what it all means and where it all came from and what kind of dangers may be represented by certain kinds of activities, that you don't force yourself to have to be in conflict all the time. But, as journalists will often say, their editors are not interested in good stories. And yet, for people to understand, for Americans to understand how effective their own government was in dealing with a huge threat, I mean, that's a great story. And it's a story about democratic government. And, we need to tell more of these stories about our history. And I would say that one of the good things about having a very elderly president like Joe Biden is that he knows that history, he knows those stories, and can speak them very effectively.
So oh, nope. You gotta make the green light come on.
Hi, Jill Doherty from Georgetown University. And I would like to, I think this is a fascinating discussion, and I wanted to bring up something that's allied to it, but a little more specific. And that is an issue that I think may be hijacking the broader issue that we're discussing right now about democracy, and that is traditional values. And just in a couple of days that I've been here and in other countries, you can see this issue coming up. It's in the United States, it's here in Georgia, it's in Russia, many different places, which is if you become democratic, you will be forced to accept these values that violate the traditional values of my country. And it appears to be a very difficult thing to answer. It's not a big, should we be democratic or should we be autocratic? It's more, how is my daily life going to be affected? And the things my family have done for thousands of years will be stopped by joining Europe or joining other democracies. I'd be interested in, how do you answer that?
Can you give a specific example of what you're talking about? The challenge to do.
Sure. Okay, I'm walking down the street in Tbilisi. I have seen and I've taken photographs of at least 5 graffiti that talk about, it says LGBT propaganda. And then someone had X'd that out. So we've already got a debate going. Then I've seen choose life, which appears to be something that would have to do with abortion. That is a phrase from the United States, choose life. So these are issues that seem to me to be very aktualne, as we say, actual, here in Georgia. So how do you answer that? How do you say that you can live your traditional values in your life and still be part of what we call Western democracy?
Excellent question. Who wants to tackle that? That's a tough one.
Well, I'm not sure I even accept the premise of the question. All pushback against democracy is based on a sense of loss. But the ideal of democracies is to provide room for many different value systems. And that may be the hardest thing about a democratic culture, is for people to understand coexistence. But also the progress of arguments. I mean, France has just passed a law to make abortion, for example, a constitutional right. In the United States, things are going back the other way. There are some issues that will never be defined, and we shouldn't look at them as being synonymous with democracy. What we should say is, the processes by which we argue where we will be as a society on these issues are democratic processes. They're not violent processes. They're not exclusionary processes, and they require us all to grow and learn. I've often thought, if I were going to do a little podcast about my life now, I'd call it Learning and Unlearning. I'm going to be 77 on the 10th of March. I'm a very different person in terms of what I know and what I think than I was as a little girl growing up in provincial Vancouver, British Columbia. And democracy is a challenge. As what President Kennedy said, it's an ongoing commitment to think and rethink and learn about your fellow citizens and enlarge your reality. And when Georgia, becomes part of the European Union, it will be exposed to many more challenges, and Georgians will have those debate and discussions, and they'll make their own decisions. But I think it's the process that's democratic, not the destination.
So I think Ken wanted to add something.
I would say, too, I think that there is a general faith that democratic processes and democratic institutions will create an environment that allows society to mature and change opinions and advance and debate and discussion. It's the places that don't have that that remain static. In terms of the issues that you talk about, the EU is a club. They have established the rules of the club. People can join or they don't have to join. And Europe has taken a position on some of these issues. Some of the issues they haven't taken a position on. Article 21 in the EU Fundamental Rights relates to discrimination. And it gets to the point the ambassador was talking about, and that's tolerance and inclusion. But there are other elements of the issue that are not addressed, and each EU member country is free to take on different issues. But things have changed in democratic societies. You know, I remember when President Obama was opposed to same-sex marriage. And it was Joe Biden at a talk show one evening who said he supports the issue, and it suddenly changed. The president changed, the society changed very quickly. So these things, as the prime minister said, these things evolve over time. But in the end, countries have a right to create alliances and friends and rules of engagement. And societies can join that or not. And I think what the EU has done is it has provided incentives for countries to evolve and to join a club that is more progressive than perhaps certain societies would have been on their own.
Thank you. So I think this gentleman has the microphone now, and then we'll come back to you, sir. So yes, please.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. I'm Georgi Badridze. I'm a senior fellow at the Rondeli Foundation. I have a very simple question. Would you have an advice to democracies, especially the younger ones, in case a certain Donald Trump enters the White House next January?
Max, I think that's one for you.
Thanks. Look, I mean, I think especially for, let's say, a democracy here in Georgia, that there is still, you know, if the United States has an election that goes, that elects Donald Trump, I think it'll be very interesting to see where the United States heads. Now, I think you can have pessimistic or optimistic takes, but if the United States goes off in a darker direction, then I would increasingly look to the other democracies that are still quite strong. The European Union, the Asian democracies, and in fact, some of what we saw during the first Trump administration, actually quite interestingly, was the increasing network of U.S. allies and partners that oftentimes did not engage with each other very much. So if our allies in Europe and our allies in Asia didn't really talk to each other, they would talk through Washington to talk to each other. I'm overstating it a bit, but increasingly we saw greater interconnections, and we're seeing that now through NATO with 4 Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, attending NATO summits. And I think we would see the intensification of that. I think it would actually put the onus on Europe to do more, to stand up for democracy in a rules-based international system, potentially. And I think they would share those values not just with our U.S. allies in Asia, but with a number of democracies around the world. So I don't think the world would end. I don't think democracy will be over around the world if we were to have an election go a different direction. But I think it would also be incumbent upon the world to press the United States to make sure that we have future elections that then enable us to either right the ship or change course. And I think that's the ultimate strength of democracy. So maybe the United States is taking a bit of a hiatus from promoting democracy in the same way it did before, but that doesn't mean that others can't, maybe not fully step in to fill that void, but can do so, can do so somewhat.
Okay, I think I feel a little better, but I'm not sure. So, sir, can we get a microphone to him? It's a little hard, I know. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Emil Juray from Kyrgyzstan, from Bishkek, a country that was used to be sometimes called the island of democracy in Central Asia. And whenever we heard that, we used to feel happy about that. And lastly, recently, the current government has been very surely moving in an autocratic direction, making the choice that's posed in the title of this panel. And all of a sudden we realize that being called an island of democracy when we actually have to live with the autocratic neighbors was not a very good strategy. You're not welcomed. You're not liked by your neighbors. And this is to the point that maybe very often democracy becomes very geopoliticized, a matter of including and excluding who belongs in the club and who doesn't. And in that respect, Max was mentioning a summit for democracy or of democracy. I'm a little confused now. In 2 weeks, it's going to be kicking off in Seoul, South Korea. And I wonder if there is much of an agenda in this summit. The first summit really did look like an elite club of privileged democracies. The second was not noticeable at all. What will be the third? Whether there will be a possibility for learning that democracy, that there are many paths to climb the mountain of democracy. And the matter is really, as Prime Minister said, it's an evolutionary process. And
so what's your question?
So my question is whether the Summit of Democracy, can we expect for it to deliver some possibilities for countries that were called hybrid or half democracies, and not just preaching to the choir?
Well, I think there will definitely be some deliverables. I mean, in getting democracies together, it will be in Korea, I think, in next week or the week after. That can lead to sort of organic developments that are useful, networking democracies together. But I don't think the summit has become designed for those sort of tangible deliverables. When you're on an island, what do you need, right? Well, you need the linkages of support. Maybe it's economic engagement. Maybe it's more tangible pieces of assistance or connections that then create examples for others, so that by being an island, you make others want to come to that island or to others to emulate. And I think what we haven't quite done is really think about how to leverage the governmental capacities that we have as the United States, as wealthy European countries, because we sort of thought the market would do it, right? It would be, well, if you had democracy, we're pursuing the rule of law, well, then U.S. companies are going to come and want to do business in your country, and that's going to organically lead to growth, and that will lead to positive outcomes. But then when you see state-led efforts, such as by China through Belt and Road or other mechanisms to funnel investment into countries, and that we aren't necessarily manufacturing the goods and aren't the focus of trade for many countries, well, that isn't quite happening. So I think it is incumbent upon us to think about what are the tools that we have. And we've seen initiatives like this, Build Back Better World, which was thrown out by the Biden administration initially. The EU, I think, has Global Gateway. And those are trying to kind of leverage capital to then invest in islands of democracies, I would hope, and to compete with the autocratic money that is out there. And I think we haven't quite really figured out how to do that, or haven't really put, I think, the broader money effort, and then also just the prestige. I don't believe the president is going to Korea next week. I could be wrong, but I doubt he's getting on a plane to do that. And if the president's not showing up, it doesn't mean the United States doesn't care about democracy, but that suddenly makes that summit a little bit less attractive for many others to travel to.
Thank you. So I'm seeing lots of hands, just not from ladies. So I would ask the women to, there's one. Yeah, let's give her the mic, and then we'll go back to some of our male friends.
Thank you so much. So I'm Tina Dolbaya from CSIS. I'm part of Max's team, so I can see him being proud that I raised my hand. But, so my question is, we have one of these very interesting, I believe will be a fascinating session on Central Asia that says Central Asia in search of security and agency. And I believe that very much also applies to South Caucasus. Like our region is also very much in search of security and agency. And we have 3 different countries with completely different foreign policy toolboxes and approaches. So my question is, what do you think, how should our countries and the region, collectively speaking, balance between authoritarian China and Russia? And also, how should they navigate, I guess not balance, but navigate between democratic West and authoritarian Russia and China? What are some very concrete steps, besides the fact that, yes, we should adhere to democratic values and principles? How can this be achieved? Can this be achieved through trade, economic relations, despite, in addition to the diplomatic ties? I guess, what are some specific approaches that we should adopt? Thank you.
Tough one. You're a Caucasus hand. Would you like to tackle that?
Very carefully. Are you talking about how governments should do this, or for citizens and society? You know, I think the problem that you will have with the Chinese, and Max mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are very good to demonstrate interest, to come in with large infrastructure projects, and to create debt traps for countries. And usually when this is done and Chinese engagement in countries happen, there is no transparency whatsoever, absolutely none. And how transactions are being made, and where the money is being put, and how the money is being allocated and spent is a mystery to citizens in countries. And so my recommendations is not to tell governments they can't have relations with China, but the citizens ought to insist in these countries, parliamentarians, political parties, civil society, around the issue of transparency. They want to know what are the deals and what are the costs being paid by the country. Moreover, are there political components to that? The Chinese are very good at, they just spending $40 million in Tanzania, creating a political party school in Tanzania for ruling parties in 5 African countries. What they're teaching in those countries is fusion, what the Chinese call fusion, of how do you fuse the political party with the state. Now, some of the political parties in multi-party countries enjoy these courses. So there has to be watchdogs in terms of what type of political relationship comes with the Chinese engagement. So all of these issues, I think, are issues both for government to deal with, but it's also issues for civil society and citizens and political institutions to deal with as well.
I think I would also add that, American and Canadian companies have, been powerful in other parts of the world and had their influence. But the one thing is that their own domestic governments have moved over the years to create legal constraints on what they can do. And that there is, in fact, a political constituency in Canada to keep Canadian companies doing business abroad from being destructive in those countries. Now, it's been slow going, but we all have records that perhaps we aren't proud of. But the one thing about democratic countries in partnerships is that there is some leverage there, and there has been a growing consciousness about the need to require of Canadian American countries acting abroad adherence to certain norms that are established in their own countries.
Can I just add one specific thing that I think is not on Georgia or Caucasus countries, but it's in Brussels and the European Union, where I think getting serious about enlargement is critical, because part of what we've seen, particularly in the Western Balkans, is that the sense of enlargement actually happening, folks became pessimistic. And then when you're pessimistic about the chances of actually getting the EU, you don't take on the reforms that are needed, and then the lack of reforms means the EU has an excuse not to enlarge. And part of the EU getting serious about enlargement, frankly, is reforming itself. Every past enlargement has been preceded by treaty reform. 20 years ago, we saw the Big Bang enlargement. That was preceded by multiple treaty reform. And right now, I think that's key, because if the EU is sending a clear signal that is open to enlarging, which right now is sending that signal, I'm not exactly sure if it is, but I think that then creates a momentum upon in countries that want to be joining the EU, that there's a real opening to take strong action.
Excellent. So we don't have a lot of time left. Let's go over here, and then we'll come back over here. Yeah, and this gentleman as well. But a very quick one.
So very Hiro Akita from Tokyo. Thank you. So very quick question. When I travel to Global South, like India and also Rwanda, for example, last year, they are growing. Many Global South country wants to shift to a democracy, but for them, one of the attractive model is Singapore. Singapore, they conduct election regularly, but they have the always ruling party wins. But at the same time, Singapore achieved rapid growth, and also they established very good welfare system. So it may be related to the question of the hybrid challenge. Democracy with election, but always ruling party wins, and then very, very high, provide high, very sophisticated welfare. So how should we challenge? Or is it bad or not? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. An excellent question, Ken.
This is this age-old debate that sort of autocratic regimes or hybrid regimes are better able to advance economic progress in the country. I think the argument is bunk. You can identify dozens of countries that are democratic that have performed better economically than autocratic countries. You can identify dozens of autocratic countries that have driven their economy into the ground. You look at Burma. Burma was supposed to be the Korea of Asia at one point. What has the military regimes done in Burma over the years? A large population, was supposed to be an Asian tiger. So this notion of picking Singapore, I won't say what I want to say about Singapore in this regard, but it's sort of a nation state. It's a unique nation. Yeah, it's a unique situation. Amartya Sen used to write about this issue, and he said probably you can look at democratic regimes that perform better economically, autocratic regimes that would perform poorly, and the opposite. Therefore, if both can do it, why not advance a democratic system that treats its citizens differently than an autocratic regime? It has a value in and of itself. And usually what happens in autocratic regimes over time, even what's so-called benign autocratic regimes, over time hubris sets in, corruption sets in, and these regimes seem stable until they're not stable.
Yes, we're seeing signs of that in Singapore now, actually. So, sir, and then over to you.
Thank you. A quick question. My name is Georgi Kandelaki. I'm with Sovlab, a think tank. The weaponization of the LGBT issue has already been pointed out by Jill Dorothy as an important example of autocracies fearing democracy. And indeed, weaponization of the LGBT question has been one of the hallmarks of the Russian government for many, many years. And to bring the discussion, to inject a little bit of Georgia in this discussion, just recently, our own government has launched initiative, legal initiative on fighting LGBT propaganda, as they put it. Another example would be, of course, of the favorite lines of Russian disinformation, accusing the so-called global war party, the European Union and the United States, of their pressure on Georgia to drag Georgia into war. Quote. Incidentally, that is exactly what the Russian government and the openly Russia-linked groups say. And the question would be this, perhaps to Mr. Wollack or anyone else who wants to take it. Do you think this harmony, this harmonization of message between the Russian, the Georgian government and governments and the pro-Russian groups has been fully understood in Washington?
In short, yes, I think it's been understood. I think what has happened over the last 2 decades is that what's called authoritarian learning. You'll find a piece of legislation in Zambia that will be replicated in Ethiopia 3 weeks later, or legislation in Russia that will be duplicated in Tunisia 2 weeks later. So there is this network now among autocratic regimes that share experiences and expertise and methods. And these are not rule by law, rule of law that the Prime Minister, this is rule by law. And there are model legislations now that are shared. If you look at the Hungarian law on LGBT, this is an example of a law that doesn't technically violate Article 21, but is an outlier in terms of EU countries on this issue.
By the way, maybe our Georgian friends will correct me, but didn't I just see in the news that Georgia recently adopted a foreign agents law? No? It was rejected. Thank goodness. Okay. That's really good news. Sir?
Last question, so I'll be short. Zurab Chiaberashvili, United National Movement. I'd like to bring the security dimension back to our discussion. All the, if not all, but most of the countries in 90s and 2000s who did free market and democratic reforms in Eastern and Central Europe, they did so under the security umbrella of NATO. So paradigm was that NATO first and then EU. Now what we see is that we talk about the EU enlargement, but not much about the NATO. So, and the issue in this country is how to do deep reforms, bring foreign investment with high risks here without the security umbrella from NATO. So do we see the change of paradigm, or how you assess the situation now? Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and I think it's not fully. I don't think there's a clear plan. I don't think it's been discussed sort of very clearly in Washington or in other European capitals about what has to come first. Does Georgia have to become a NATO member? Does Ukraine have to become a NATO member before joining the European Union? And I think the problem with saying that Georgia or Ukraine have to become NATO members is that there's a big problem, and this is also true for Moldova when there's Russian bases and Russian territory, or the Russians occupy Georgian and Ukrainian territory. And then what does that mean for NATO in implicating Article 5 and the security commitment? And we just saw how difficult it was to get Finland and Sweden through the wickets to become NATO members, and Sweden hopefully will be today, tomorrow, sometime very soon, officially become the 32nd member, and they don't have Russian troops on their territory. So how does the EU then reckon with that? And that is something that I think Brussels has not sort of fully turned over. This is true in Chisinau as well. And I think that becomes a major issue for the European Union. There is a precedent in Cyprus, and it's not necessarily a perfect precedent, but part of EU territory is actually controlled by Turkey. So that, but that I don't think is a model that anyone wants to replicate based off of the assumption that in 2004, when Cyprus became a member, that that the dispute would be resolved. So I think this is a major challenge, and I think it's likely one that I don't think has to be. I guess what I would say, maybe just to close, is that I think waiting for a clear answer is also not the right course. Because if you're just waiting for the EU or NATO to figure out how we would actually resolve this, I think that's not the path. I think in some ways it has to be resolved here, or in Kyiv or in Chisinau, of how they would pursue, how they want to pursue, and to move as close to the EU as possible. And then that creates a potential for NATO membership as well.
Fantastic answer. An excellent question. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. Maybe the gentleman in the back there. Can we get him? Yes. The gentleman in the back there against the doors. Yes, exactly.
Thank you. My name is Arsen Kharatyan. I run an Armenian-Georgian media platform called Giorgio Armani. It's called ALIC, actually. My question is with regards to how far are we ready to go in pressuring autocracies going against democracies, in particular in South Caucasus. I mean, it's now a textbook example that any former Soviet country that aspires to democracy is being punished, and that punishment is territorial. And now, right now, we're hearing aggression from Azerbaijan coming into Armenia. Although we see a lot of support from the West politically, we're starting to see some other types of support. But are we ready to talk about sanctions? And I would like to talk a little bit about the sanctions and the role of the sanctions in preventing autocracies from attacking democracies?
Excellent, thank you. Who wants to tackle that? Well, it's a gigantic question, actually.
So
Maxwell,
yeah, I'll have a go.
Good for you.
So I think, look, if you look at U.S. sanctions, and what's clear is they did not work at deterring Russia from invading Ukraine. And I think that's in part because we had already sanctioned Russia. I think Putin was optimistic that the war would go very quickly and that the West wouldn't actually be able to wean itself off of Russian fossil fuels and would be reluctant to sort of do what it did in terms of freezing central bank assets. I think he miscalculated there. But then when you look at the success of sanctions, you could say, well, they haven't worked at sort of destroying the Russian economy, of ending the war in this sort of very maximalist view. And I think that's the wrong lens to view them. I think what they have done is effectively attrited the Russian economy the same way providing a 155 millimeter mortar shell to Ukraine attrits the Russian military when they use it. And I think there has been a precedent set. And I think you could, for instance, if you look at the field of nonproliferation, you could say sanctions have failed against North Korea in preventing North Korea from really developing its nuclear arsenal. On the other hand, sanctions have really imperiled the North Korean economy. I don't think anyone really wants to be like North Korea. So have they succeeded or failed? Well, I think it's mixed. And I think it's a complicated sector, and one that should sanctions be on the table when a country uses aggression against another? Absolutely, such as in the South Caucasus. And I think it's something that we have to be willing to do because in part it's also signaling the West's intentions. And that symbolically, I think, is also very important.
Well, listen, thank you, everyone. I'm a little bit sorry that our panel was so North American in its focus, but I think we'll make up for that later on. I hope we'll get a lot more European input later in the conference. But for now, I'd just like to thank you all for coming. And I think since nobody's fallen asleep, we should probably quit while we're ahead and just move on to the next event. So thank you very much for coming, and thanks to our panelists. Excellent. Thank you all.